director to you who will give the first of this afternoon's paper.
Phil, let me open this up for you, and we'll be all set.
So, good afternoon. It's a privilege to be here, and I want to, at the very beginning, pay tribute to Bob Russell, Ted Peters, CTNS. As someone who's observed CTNS almost from the beginning, it's something to admire and something to congratulate. And I won't be able to be here tomorrow for that celebrative set of events, but I want to express my appreciation and my admiration and congratulations now.
Bill, weren't you the second J.K. Russell Fellow?
Third,
I
think. I was looking at that list. Oops. Well, as oftentimes, I didn't want to do that. As oftentimes happens, when you get an invitation to write something, you already have an agenda going. And I had an agenda going with regard to God and evolution, and I couldn't help but manifest that agenda to a considerable extent in my paper. I think I will get at that agenda by referring to a recent book by Simon Goldhill, the classic scholar at Oxford, who loves sex and tragedy, how the ancient Greeks influence us today. And he has a marvelous discussion there of the Athenian Enlightenment in the 5th century BC, in which he quotes ancient authors that could appear in a contemporary discussion of religion and science, and one would hardly recognize how far in the past they wrote. The classic struggle between the myths we hold and the advance in our philosophical and scientific knowledge. And that in the 5th century BC, the Athenians were very well aware that there was a struggle as myths were engaged by the new knowledge, as the new knowledge was engaged by the myth. And that struggle is one that I have been working in, experiencing, and trying to think through most of my career. And I think it's an issue, a setting, a context in which evolution and God is very significant. But it's not the struggle of ID, creationism, and evolutionism. It's an older struggle, and it has some different kinds of people involved. People who believe in God and also accept evolution, and people who accept evolution and don't believe in God. I won't call them atheists. I think that prejudices the case. I call them people who don't believe in God. I'm involved right now, have been for a couple of years, in a very energetic discussion. There's one person in this room who's also a part of the discussion, Stan Klein, the physicist there. And so that explains why, in some respects, I was eager for my paper to be considered to be a complement, C-O-M-P-L-E-M-E-N-T. As an editor of a journal, I know that compliment often is spelled with an I. That's a totally different word. Don't need to remind this group. And so it's this engagement, and I hope that it contributes something. I hope that it might contribute some alternative insights even, but very much is intended as a complement to what Ted and Marty have done. I say at the outset of my paper that it is perhaps to be put in the category of a spirituality reflection. And I focus on evolution under the rubric of the energies of God. The energies of God, coming out of classical Christian theology, which reminded us, particularly the tradition of apophatic theology, that we cannot talk about the ousia, the being of God. Our human minds are incapable of comprehending the ousia of God, but we can focus on the energies of God, the works of God. I think perhaps this might be related to what Alex was talking about when he talked about the ordaining power of God. And when we do that, we recognize, let's see, where are we here? We recognize that the energies of God are both various and paradoxical. And the paradoxes of evolution are something that I want to focus on in this time of explanation. An evolutionary continuum of deterministic causes gives rise to creatures who are hardwired for freedom. The continuum's randomness betrays no inherent purpose or meaning, yet from it emerge creatures who are hardwired to seek meaning and who live their lives as if driven by purposes. Evolutionary processes give evidence of chance and also necessity. A wholly material and unconscious process evolves for most of its history and then suddenly gives birth to creatures of consciousness and mind and spirit and culture and morality, and we might also add spirituality. Evolutionary processes are deterministic systems, and yet at certain points, autocatalysis enters into the processes, autopoiesis or self-generation, and what appears from one aspect to be wholly determined appears from another vantage point to be a realm of possibility. The evolution of living creatures is a process in which cooperation and altruism is fostered. At the same time, every creature lives as part of a chain of predation, occupying the niche of predator as well as that of prey. Those are the paradoxes of evolution, not taken from evolutionary theory, although the theory lies behind it, not taken from scientific research, although scientific research figures in all of those paradoxes, but in the encounter or the engagement with evolution in our lives. In what Teilhard de Chardin, and I rely on him quite a bit, talked about as an interior engagement or an engagement of evolution with interiority. And this has to be construed theologically as an engagement with the energies of God, with the works of God. And I want to read just one section of my paper, picking up on this number E. What appears to be from one aspect to be wholly determined appears from another vantage point to be a realm of possibility. I'm speaking not of the science of emergence. I'm speaking of the obvious trajectory, which is the ground and ferment of studies of emergence, that from the radiation and particles of the Big Bang there have emerged organic life and creatures of mind and spirit, culture, morality, and spirituality. This is the top of page 10. However crudely or non-technically I state it, it is a staggeringly blunt empirical fact of evolution. I have said that this may be the biggest evolutionary paradox of all. In this trajectory, possibility looms as important as actuality. If you look from Big Bang to human culture, I don't see how one can avoid saying possibility is as important as actuality. What a thing can become is as important as what a thing has been in its evolutionary history. If scientists really nail down emergence theory, as it appears they will, their work will in effect be an announcement that even in the realm of evolutionary biology, possibility is as fundamental as actuality. Our ideas of time and causality will be bent, warped, as we consider the paradoxical driving force of possibility. Theologians will wonder whether biology is not approaching in its purview the reality of eschatology and the hunch that the future impacts the past and present as significantly as our evolutionary history conditions the future. If emergence is taken with utter seriousness, and I'm of course assuming that evolution is a process in which emergence is of enormous importance, we might feel that we are entering a puzzling new order, requiring the reconceiving of time and place. I think that that is an insight that science will always play down and try to minimize. That's why scientific studies of the human being are so unsatisfactory for human beings, because they play down the range of this emergence. But something that in our ordinary experience just hits us right in the face, that this process, call it evolution, call it whatever one might, is a process of this stupendous emergence, which gives us every reason to believe, I think, that possibility is as significant as actuality. And of course, this possibility has a double face for us. On the one hand, it's the ground of all our hopes. It's a ground for our entertaining the notion of redemption. It also is a force of diminishment. The emergences that are hoped for often don't come into being. Emergence is matched by extinction and disappearance. Emergence can be as overwhelming and denying to us as it is positive and hopeful. But yet, we give preeminence, particularly in the Christian faith, but I think in most religions, we give preeminence to the fact that that emergence as positive possibility and redemption is the predominant. I think that this kind of discussion, which is an attempt to talk about God, or part of the attempt to talk about God in a way that serves as an interpretation of evolution, is the most important. I think that we mustn't let the discussion with ID and creationism and the contemporary culture wars narrow our discussion. This is a big discussion. And it's a discussion that is as old, at least, as the 5th century BC in Athens. And there will always be people who look at that marvelous process of emergence that we call evolution and be compelled to talk about God and be compelled to talk about the human being as a creature of destiny and possibility. And there will always be people who find the God hypothesis impossible or even unattractive. even those people will probably also believe that human beings are special. Langdon Gilkey's man in the white syndrome, should say the person in the white coat syndrome. When the scientist lays the human being out on the table, the human being is highly determined, very fragile, not that special, etc. Steven Pinker wrote a piece not too long ago in Time magazine in which he has about the most minimalist view of the human being that you can imagine. But on the other hand, the scientist who's observing the human being doesn't accept any of those constraints. The scientist who is studying the human being is a creative, imaginative individual, has the capability of even reflecting on human existence, can determine what data are important, can determine how to interpret those data, and the future is open. We've got to recognize that experience of the scientist, and it could be the theologian, it could be anyone else, that experience of the scientist itself is part of the data to be construed by the scientific study of human beings. We're concerned that we don't experience the death of God, and we're concerned that we don't experience the death of human beings. And I want to keep that very much in the forefront of this discussion. Should I sit down?
It's up to you.
Yeah, why don't I sit down?
Thank you, Phil. Ted, would you like to take a first?
I'll pass.
You'll pass? We're then open, Bob, right? Yes, Mark.
I feel like I'm hogging the floor with a lot of people who haven't spoken once around this table here, and I'm on my third, but thank you. When I hear the term emergence, I think of that term that Polkinghorne has thrown around from time to time of evolutionary optimism, of a process of emergence that itself, by having possibility in this emergent interpretation of evolution, of redemption built into it. And this gets to Marty and Ted's paper, where there are these modest openings up of movements forward, but they always require the presentation to the future. There's this relationship between a more final transformation that's going on in your work also. So it gets to a question of Christology for me in the end. And that is emergence only satisfied when we think of God coming to us from the outside, and that's what Christ represents, not as the most sufficient representation of logos that could ever happen in human form, which was sort of like a liberal rendering of Jesus, but something that crashes in from the outside, and that is the source of transformation proleptically for something that will be fulfilled later. How do you see this emergent process? And Lionel Thornton, by the way, is a figure in the early part of the 20th century who did exactly that. He was one of the best interpreters of Whitehead that I've read, all the way through up to the point where he gets to his Christology, and then all of a sudden it almost feels magical as this figure from outside the process comes in order to complete the process. But how does it fit with your Christology, this notion of emergence? I guess I'm introducing too big of a piece here, but I want to know where you would go with that, and how your more modest redemptive transformations within the laws of nature fit with this more final kind of transformation that you want to talk about.
I can give a complete account of emergence, but one aspect of emergence that I think is quite relevant is the holistic aspect. That is to say, that what emerges is a new whole that is greater than the sum of the constituent parts, that made it up, that made it up originally. I think of eschatological consummation in that way, that eschatological consummation is not, in the apocalyptic sense, the destruction of the old, the substitution of something new, but rather it's a fulfillment of what is going on. When I think about the second person of the Trinity and incarnation, the theology of the cross side, the finite Jesus in time and space, really belongs to this world in the same sense that everything else in this world belongs to it. One of the aspects of that I think that is important is that God is experiencing the world in its finitude, in the same way that the rest of us who are finite creatures experience it, and also in terms of suffering and death. Now, the theology of the resurrection is, well, dead people usually stay dead, but in this case, there's an Easter resurrection, and that really takes up into itself everything that Jesus had been before. I like to think of the incarnation retroactively, that is to say, from the resurrection looking backwards. And then the resurrection of Jesus is a prolepsis of the consummation of all things. We'll be talking about Bob Russell's work in a little bit, but as John Polkinghorne looks ahead to the eschaton, he'll say, you know what? Some of the laws of nature are going to have to be different then for lions to lie down with lambs than they are now. What I think Bob Russell adds is that, the laws of nature have been variable over time all along. And what we have in the Easter resurrection of Jesus is the first instantiation of a law of nature which will be universally applicable in the future. Well, with that kind of thinking, it seems to me that one doesn't have to split between what's internal to the natural world, which has a history, and an external act on the part of an intervening God. But one can think with some coherence of a consummation in which what currently we experience as alien will actually be common, within a sense of fulfillment. So the difference between an internal process that all of us are part of every day and an external divine intervention, I think finally withers away within that scheme. Now, I haven't tied up all the shoelaces here, but that's my first attempt to get at what you're saying.
Phil, do you want to?
Well, I'm trying to suggest a totally different perspective. Not this abstract conceptualization. I'm trying to talk, which has a place, but talk about how we experience evolution as the energies of God. And of course, when we're aware of the limitations of the human mind, we can't even begin to talk about what's God's feeling. How would we know what God's feeling? That's totally off limits for theology and the human mind.
What about your doctrine of incarnation? Wouldn't there at least be something that you could say about God's feeling?
Not about God's ousia, no. I mean, how would one know that? And it takes away I think the pathos and the struggle of our experiential encounter with evolution. Our experiential engagement with evolution, if we consider it to be the work of God, is more like the experience of Job, more like the experience of the people of Israel, more like the experience of the contemporaries of Jesus of Nazareth. And I actually think that the engagement with people who do not believe in God is not dealt with so adequately by tossing abstract concepts at them. It's dealt with, I think, more powerfully by talking about what it means to engage the actualities of evolution. We call them the energies of God. The person who doesn't believe in God, it's just one damn thing after another. But we share the experience, and we share the Job experience. We share the Jesus of Nazareth experience, whether we believe in God or not. And I'm not saying this is the only way to go at it, but I think it's a way of going at evolution that deserves some attention. And I think it's exactly what the ID creationism controversy drags us away from. And I think that needs to be dealt with. That's why I'm so pleased that Marty and Ted are dealing with it. But I think we have to sort of play two ball games at once. And I'm struggling to find a way to describe that other ball game. But it's just as critically focused on evolution and what evolution means for human life.
I wanted to respond just a little bit to your point about emergence and your question about how, I guess what you said we had written about is sort of the small openings up of the future compared to the big picture that you...
I wanted to know the relationship.
The relationship between those, which I think is a critical link maybe between dealing with the actual experience of evolution compared to what I think they'll call a more abstract thing that we might throw at people, the larger continuum of it. And I think this idea of emergence, or of emergent properties, of emergence becoming an acceptable and measurable phenomenology in science is actually quite critical, at least in the biological sciences. No, it already was in other sciences, but in the biological sciences, the acceptance of that as real phenomenology as opposed to epiphenomenon, which is what it had been called in the past, is going to be a critical link between them. Because when Ted and I write in our work about the present being opened up, being released from the past and opened up to the possibilities of the future, I think we are trying to make a link between what we see as the observational experience of evolution, that is, that all of this possibility exists in the nature of how the evolutionary process works, and out of that emerges new form. Make a link between that and that larger emergence in the end. Now, I don't think the link is completely, it's certainly nowhere near complete. What we're trying to do, I think, is establish some language that is going to allow the different voices in the conversation to start making potential sense together. So when I'm talking to scientists who are dealing with biological networks and emergent properties and the like, and trying to think in terms of how higher form emerges out of more than the sum of the parts, it may ultimately be using language that's similar to the theological that you use. That's my hope. There is no complete linguistic system yet that expresses that relationship.
I just reply in a sentence to Phil. Phil, I don't know what you mean by abstraction, but I think the only thing that keeps experience from being just self-reflexive or self-referential is its relation to what is the case. What is the nature of the reality that the experience refers to? And I think if that's what you mean by abstraction, then, I don't know what you mean exactly, but when the theologian is referring to particular realities that break in and change states of affairs, that's a pretty big deal. And it may come across as an abstraction, but that becomes the basis for the way, say, a Christian community experiences its relation to the reality.
Well, I mean, there's a dialectic there, there's a give and take there, but I don't look at Christian doctrine or philosophical doctrine as a set of labels waiting to be pinned on something. I mean, for example, so I would say about the incarnation that first of all, the incarnation, the Chalcedonian decree, is a way of accounting for the Christian experience of Jesus. It's not a look into the mind of God. It seems to me that out of the engagement with Jesus, Christians were compelled to say we've encountered God. And that's what the Chalcedonian Decree is all about. It's about encountering God under the conditions of human existence. So I'm not much taken with the way you state it, Mark, because it doesn't come to me that way. You know, Job undoubtedly knew what the voice from the whirlwind told him. But the voice from the whirlwind had to tell him, you really didn't get it, did you, Job? You knew it, but you really didn't get it. And of course, you might even say Jesus as the suffering servant is a way of the tradition saying, you knew this the moment you read Isaiah, didn't you? But you really didn't get it. So I think that the existential engagement has to be taken into account. And I actually think that the kind of engagement that Goldhill's talking about going back to the 5th century BC is not so much an engagement with people who decided they were going to be atheists. It's an engagement with people who say somehow what you're saying isn't cogent for my experience. And so then the struggle is how do you try to communicate in a way that's most cogent, and maybe you never will.
Peter.
Thank you. Andrew Louth, in his fascinating book, Discerning the Mystery, says that a mystery is not so much a problem to be solved as that before which we must remain silent. And he accuses a lot of modernity of wanting to abdicate its religious obligation to simply enjoy and contemplate the mystery. And I was noticing, Phil, on page 9, where you talk about the hiddenness of God and the paradoxes of evolution, a parallel with Ted and Marty's point that God identifies with the victims of unfitness. I know that all three of you would absolutely distinguish yourself from Darwin's black box as an approach to hiddenness or something unknown. But I'm wondering how you would see mystery as fitting in both on the scientific and on the theological side of this discourse. Do ID and creationism, can they be convicted of abdicating mystery in religion and attempting to obfuscate issues by putting it into science?
Well, maybe they can. I would add Tillich's discussion of mystery that it's maybe not something that we only remain silent in the face of, but it's something, and this contrasts it with a puzzle, it's something that we continually probe, and as we probe it, ever more is disclosed to us, and we are in fact grasped by the mystery. The mystery isn't something we observe or play around with, it's something that grasps us. And I think that the testimony of a great deal of human existence and Christian existence is that there's a constant struggle, you see. What it means for God to identify with the victim is always taking on new meaning, and of course victim is prejudicing the case too. You should just say with suffering and negation, and of course the way of faith. I mean that's what we have to remember is the resolution of these issues for the person who believes in God as well as the person who doesn't believe in God is faith. It's not knowledge. And I think that maybe that's one problem I do see with creationism and ID is that they, to my way of thinking, they make faith into a kind of special knowledge, rather cerebrally defined. And of course, coming out of the Lutheran tradition, I'm not going to do that.
I'm looking at the passage you pointed us to here on page 9 of Phil's paper in the section on the paradoxes. The governance of God dare not be conceptualized in opposition to autopoiesis and self-generation. No matter how discordant it may seem to our minds, the web of predation and the web of love must somehow be finally one, even though that oneness may never become actual within the continuum of finite history. The lion and the lamb may never lie down together prior to the eschaton. Well, Phil is a former teacher of mine, and he's just absolutely right about these things.
Now,
Now, getting to your question, it seems to me that, and he had just actually articulated it rather well. On the one hand, this is something we take by faith because we can't see it. On the other hand, it's a big problem for theologians to have to deal with. And I think Phil is telling us, as you deal with it, don't ask for some kind of easy way of dissolving the paradox. Do you see this as guilty of some intellectual malfeasance? Is that what led to your question?
just let me add though on that, that paragraph that he read tells us what we can say, cannot say cataphatically. It doesn't tell us how predation and love are related, or how God's governance and self-generation are related. It tells us that if you put together a concept that puts them at odds with one another in an ultimate way, you're not doing Christian theology. It doesn't tell us how to resolve it. So it's an apophatic response to that. Just as the dogmas of the Incarnation and the Trinity don't so much tell you what you have to believe as what things you probably shouldn't believe.
When Ted and I and a number of other people from CTNS went to lunch with Dwayne Gish and Henry Morris down at ICR, I found no room for apophasis. Everything was cataphatic. Everything was neatly tied up with a bow. There was no room for mystery. In fact, they prided themselves on saying, we are not theologians. We do not need to be. We are scientists. So I just wondered whether that's an abdication on the Christian, in the Christian dimension of a mystery that is suitably kept a mystery.
Okay.
I think it is. One of my favorite scientists, I won't mention the name, biologist, has written eloquently about the fact that obviously this person will admit that they encounter mystery. And when they encounter mystery, they say, okay, that's a mystery. Can't deal with it, I'll go on. Well, that's not what I'm talking about.
But I think Peter's point is that what we see in the creationists is an attempt to eliminate the mystery, provide a single coherent scheme in which all the mysteries are resolved, and we can explain the conflict between predation and love as the fall.
And either that or they're trivialized. Yeah.
Bob was next, and we'll take one more in this section, then we'll move on to our next paper, and then we're going to have a general discussion before our break. So,
Phil, thank you for your paper. It's really elegant. I want to add two supporting comments to this issue about hiddenness. One is the theology of the cross, of course. And I take that so seriously because as you look at nature and try to say, well, somehow the suffering of nature is embraced by God through Christ's suffering, well, it's a beautiful way to say that and not get stuck on the problem of how is God responsible for this or what is God doing about it. God is suffering with it. So I think your emphasis on hiddenness really is enhanced with this notion of theology of the cross. And the second thing, I don't like a lot of John Hicks' ideas, but one thing I do like is that God has to be hidden in order for us to come to an assertion of faith to believe or not to believe in God. It can't be forced upon us. And yet God can be so hidden that there's kind of irrevocable evidence against God. So it's a kind of, so you put it well, because you say God's revealed and God's hiddenness. And so it's that dialectic of evolution is God acting, and yet it's God acting in a way which, knowing it's God acting, is hidden to us. So I
God is so hidden that sometimes people lose their faith.
Right, but not so hidden that you're forced to.
Right.
Right. So what I want to say is that the hiddenness of God is precisely the right amount such that you still have a choice. You must choose whether to see it as God hidden or no God hidden. Right. And that's essential for the journey of faith. And that coincides with the theology of the cross, in which you can decide whether this is somehow a hidden triumph for life or whether it's an ultimate tragedy.
That's why the voice from the whirlwind in Job is so meaningful to me, because it's saying just exactly what you just said.
Okay. Now let's thank Phil again. And I'd like to now welcome Antje Jacqueline, who will lead us through a discussion of a critical view of theistic evolution.
Do I need that?
Or you can either, Darren, is this one okay?
Is that okay? Good.
Stay around that, that'll be great.
Well, wave at me if I don't.
Would you rather use this?
Well, I could.
Is this on now, Darren?
Is it unmuted?
Does it work?
Is it working?
Yeah, do you hear me? Okay, I guess he does. First of all, let me express my gratitude for this opportunity of scholarly discussion. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with colleagues and friends, and also to join in the celebration of so much good work in religion and science that has been done for so many years now. And it is with joy that I join in congratulating you and celebrating CTNS 25 remarkable years. I would like to preface the presentation of my paper with a comment on the title I've chosen, A Critical View of Theistic Evolution. With this title, I seem to be hiding the genuine praise I have for Ted's and Marty's project under its opposite, namely critique. I guess you can tell I'm a Lutheran.
Yes.
The greatest strength of the project, in my view, is that thinking about creation and evolution is lifted to a level that includes redemption and eschatology. This is not an easy task, as discussion has already shown, but it is a task that I applaud wholeheartedly because I think it is necessary. The obsession with origins that has marked so many conversations about creation and evolution has been detrimental in my view. So I look forward to seeing this aspect of Ted's and Marty's work taking off in what could be exciting directions. But I also have a concern, and this is where my critique sets in. In my paper, I conclude that the label theistic evolution is an unfortunate choice. It belongs to a stage of reasoning that Ted and Marty have surpassed by broad margin. The term theistic evolution lags far behind the insights presented in their paper. And actually the story you told last night, Ted, of how you came across that really reassures me that I'm onto something. That is right here. Well, to say it with an image, by using theistic evolution, you try to squeeze your ideas into shoes that are far too small to fit. And I'm afraid that if you get stuck with these small shoes, the project won't be able to walk, and even less to fly. So how do I arrive at this conclusion? In the paper, I have built my argument in 3 steps. First, I look at problems and difficulties pertaining to theistic, and to evolution in the phrase theistic evolution. Then, in terms of my own theological appraisal of the theory of evolution, I offer some brief thoughts on the concept of the secular and some tentative reflections on horizontal gene transfer. First, some thoughts about the problems with theistic. One of the difficulties with the use of theistic in Ted St. Marty's writings is the fact that philosophical and metaphysical implications of the term remain largely unaddressed. Typically, theism is used in the context of discussions about the rationality or reasonableness of the idea of a God, and most famously, perhaps, in connection with arguments for the existence of God. Since theistic arguments for the existence of God are largely believed to be a failure, there is a risk that this proposal of theistic evolution may be relegated to the same camp of beguiling but unpersuasive thought structures, and that would be quite undeservedly so. Theoretically, the theism debate belongs into a culture of rationalism, even if the debate itself often rests on emotional rejections of the arguments of the other side. This culture of rationalism, however, is not the type of culture in which many of the current debates on evolution versus creation take place. The people who are most fervently opposed to evolution rarely argue on the basis of philosophical statements about rationalism. Many of them voice their resistance on the grounds of morality instead, pursuing the argument that evolution leads to a relativism of values and to such allegedly evil things as postmodernism. Indirectly, they confirm what they defy the most, namely that we are living in an era that is post-rationalist in many ways. And if this is correct, one must ask again whether the framework of theism really serves Ted St. Marty's goal to further the acceptance of the theory of evolution among Christian believers who feel the need to resist evolutionary theory. The statement by physicist and papal advisor Nicola Cabibbo, quoted by Ted and Marty, illustrates and strengthens my critique of the inadequacy of the theism-atheism framework to which the term theistic evolution appeals. Cabibbo allows for only two reactions to evolution, either an atheistic or a theistic one. He further says that the theistic response amounts to believing that God is the cause. This statement is erroneous in two respects. First, there are more than two possible reactions to Darwinian science, such as materialism, ontological naturalism, methodological naturalism, a variety of realisms, or mystical approaches which can be both theistic and non-theistic. So the field is much more cluttered than the alternative theistic, atheistic suggests. There is in fact room for a variety of nuances that may be anything from theistic, non-theistic, or agnostic to atheistic. And second, equating a theistic response to evolution with the belief that God is the cause of the process testifies to some philosophical and theological naivete. In various ways, theological scholarship has shown two things. God talk has called the discourse of ontology into question, and causation is not its prime concern. In sum, theistic discourse is wedded to an ontology that has lost much regard in recent times. Heidegger's critique of God as causa sui, as well as Nietzsche, Marion, and Caputo exemplify that far better than I can. Like deism, theism, and thus theistic evolution as a label, gives the impression that the principal thing to be said and explained about God is that God is the causing principle of all there is. However, causality is far from always the prime category used in God talk, and I think Alex's paper made that clear pretty nicely. And causality is better understood in a symbolical way rather than in the concrete sense of mechanical causation, for example. So awareness of the full scope of Christian theology, including such topics as incarnation, anthropology, pneumatology, eschatology, and theodicy, suggests that causation is one category among others, rather than the determining characteristic of all God talk. The attempt to keep immanence and transcendence and creation and redemption together have led to a number of new images of God in contemporary Christian theology. The image of God, the clockmaker, has given way to the image of God, the networker. The image of the unmoved mover has given way to God, the event. Admittedly, this is a plurality of images of God that often complicates the dialogue with scientists who ask for an unambiguous and unequivocally defined God term to insert into existential equations. Nevertheless, I regard it to be the responsibility of theologians to resist such simplifications and to remain faithful to the task of keeping the tension between the cataphatic and the apophatic alive, even in religion and science. So I do think that Ted's and Marty's proposal reaches beyond truncated understandings of ontology and causation, while the term they are using indicates the opposite. So my critique is therefore that the description theistic does not do justice to the richness, the importance, and the urgency of your proposal. In fact, it blacks out the seminal theological move that you are making. The second topic, evolution, and two things about that. Bob Russell has claimed that theistic evolution is, quote, the real attack on atheism. I doubt, however, whether atheism is what should or can be remedied by the concept of theistic evolution in the first place. Controversies about evolution on the one hand and atheism on the other are not synchronic, I would say. While the matrix of atheism and materialism is certainly present in controversies about evolution, the core of the perceived problem with the theory of evolution seems to me to be a humanism rather than atheism, a humanism rather than atheism. It is not so much the loss of the godness of God than the loss of the humanness of humans that concerns many of those who feel an attraction towards creation science or intelligent design. It is the dethronement of humans rather than the God question that shakes people up. The heat and aggression noted in numerous debates about evolution stem from fear of the death of man rather than the death of God. If this is true, we are faced with an anthropological challenge more than with a theological one. It is not atheism or the rejection of God that is the critical issue, but the anthropological question of what it means to be human and what constitutes the uniqueness of humanity. Addressing this challenge effectively within the framework of evolution requires a sound anthropology rather than a debate about theism and atheism. It requires an anthropology that tells the story of what it means to be human in sinu nature and coram Deo, with a strong emphasis on the and between these two. And my second remark on evolution. Evolution, it is a scientific theory, and as such, it is of course neither theistic or atheistic. It seems inappropriate to baptize a scientific theory by adorning it with the epithet theistic. It also seems problematic to speak of theologians in terms of evolutionists, because this kind of language turns a scientific theory into an ideology. I doubt that this is helpful in what sometimes with an equally unfortunate terminology is called the culture war between evolution and creationism or intelligent design. In addition, it makes Marty and Ted vulnerable to the accusation of doing themselves precisely that which they hold against New Age spirituality and sociobiology, namely promoting an ideological variant that covers over serious science. In terms of suggestions, two and very brief. First, I suggest that a constructive appraisal of the secular as a category beyond the dualism of theism and atheism is one helpful way to get beyond some of the impasses that come with the label theistic evolution. Reckoning with secular culture challenges theologians to unpack the parcel evolution beyond the features deep time, natural selection, common descent, divine action, and theodicy. It also counteracts the possible misunderstanding that theistic evolution is about Christianizing a scientific theory and thus a religious infringement on science, like intelligent design has been accused of. And my second brief suggestion, it appears that modern biology today has more in common with the theological language of relationality than with the discourse of theism and atheism. And both Noreen's comments earlier and Bill's comments earlier hinted at that too, that relationship is more fundamental than cause. So where the language of theism tends to pull away from the messiness of interrelatedness, the language of contemporary biology frequently uses the vocabulary of relationality. Today, biologists emphasize the significance of system, focus to a greater extent than previously on wholes as compared to parts, and seek to understand parts in relationship rather than in isolation, and increase the attention paid to connections and interactions over against the definition of autonomous elements, and describe properties of systems as emerging results of the whole, which is more than the sum of the parts, and we have heard that all over today. So it seems to me that the phenomenon of horizontal gene transfer would be a marvelous example to illustrate that quite clearly should become part of the theological appraisal of evolutionary theory. And I think I side here with Ian Barber's appeal to Marty to do more of what he really wants to do. And that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.